Welcome back, this time to the final video in the LibraScope month of Super Nintendo Classics. To close things out, we're taking a look at Rare's Donkey Kong Country, which was released the latest in the lifespan of the Super Nintendo for the games we've looked at this month, all the way in 1994. DKC is one of those games that I got to play on a handful of occasions, but I never had any good friends who owned it. It's a game that looked incredibly impressive at release, and a lot of people felt it played just as well, hence why it's still pretty well remembered today and continues to get sequels. As most of you will probably know, DKC uses sprites based on high-end CG models for a lot of its artwork, and used a fresh Donkey Kong design that felt less like an arcade character and more like a modern gaming mascot of the time. This new aesthetic was its claim to fame, since it gave the game a distinct look that made it feel technically advanced. I myself was amazed by it when I was younger, though I didn't exactly know why it looked the way it did. But fast forward to today, and I've gotta say, I think it's pretty ugly. The sprites lack the definition and animation clarity that you'd get from hand-drawn pixel art of the time, and many of the levels are dark, muddy, and repetitive. The model work is still impressive for the time, but I don't think it translated to a particularly vibrant game. In fact, for me personally, it's one of the least appealing looking games from that era. That's not really a criticism, of course, since it did the job well for the time, but similar to how we look back on all of the gray, moody looking military shooters from the late 2000s and see an aesthetic that just doesn't seem to have much life in it, these days I feel the same way about DKC's aesthetic. I can't help but to notice things like the stray, gray pixels that are strewn all over Diddy Kong's sprite, making it look like a poorly cut out JPEG, something you might not be able to notice at all on a CRT television, but stares me in the face on a modern display. I can't help but notice the animation that sometimes looks really clunky and stiff. It's not like artists at the time didn't understand great animation in games. Rather, it's likely that the new technology and techniques being used limited these artists in question. They sacrificed clarity and precision for the grandeur of CG. I totally understand why people are okay with the way the game looks, and I don't blame them, but I see it as a quaint reminder of a bygone age, just like some of the clearly aged CG cutscenes from the PlayStation era not long after. It's not all bad, mind you. DKC sounds pretty great. Sound effects are mostly average in terms of punch, but none of them are annoying, and they all serve the purpose that they're supposed to. The music ranges from barely noticeable to absolutely classic, which means I definitely wouldn't call any of it poorly written or arranged by any means. Some of it's just not my style, well, some of it is. The game's length is just right, and it does try to use its limited palette of themes in interesting ways to keep it feeling like you're progressing. The controls are decently unique, with a roll that can defeat many enemy types, and seems to speed you up faster and faster the more enemies you roll through in succession. This roll can then turn into a run. For a player who's played the game a lot and mastered it, these mechanics probably provide a decent amount of depth that reminds more than just me of the way Sonic is designed. But at the same time, if you're new, the controls provide a pretty standard platformer feel that can be carried through the whole game if that's the way you want to play it instead. The game gives you a 2-hit life system by giving you access to 2 characters, if you can find your partner in a DK barrel. You can then switch between these characters at will, and whoever is in reserve takes over if the leader takes a hit. As many others have noted, Diddy is pretty much always preferred, since he jumps slightly higher and further and generally moves faster than DK. DK can defeat some enemies without barrels that Diddy can't, and can smash his hands on the ground for an extra attack. But what ultimately puts things in Diddy's favor is the fact that his hitbox is smaller and feels more consistent than DK's. Unfortunately, my issues with Donkey Kong Country only expand from this one. To begin, thanks to these giant, awkward sprites used for characters and enemies, as well as the organic 2.5D looking platform tiles, a lot of the level collision and hitboxes can come off as really unclear to a new player. This is a problem I was stuck dealing with for the whole game. There were a lot of times where I hit an enemy or a platform slightly wrong and was punished for it, but often it wasn't clear why or where I had made the mistake. In something like Super Mario World, you know exactly where enemies are dangerous from, where they can be hit from, and how big Mario's hitbox is at all times. Visually, it has the right amount of clarity and it feels consistent. DKC doesn't. This is once again a case where the style of a game hampers the actual design itself. And it's not just the hitboxes either. A lot of other touches that look nice on paper can harm gameplay too. As a pretty clear example, take a look at these fish and how they move. Fish in DKC tend to bob up and down as they swim, but this movement doesn't consistently line up with their horizontal pattern, nor does it seem to be influenced by the player's position in relation to the fish. What this means is that the inconsistencies between the vertical movement and horizontal movement of the fish make them incredibly random to dodge at times, particularly with a big character like DK. Sure, it's cool that they had a more thought put into their swimming animations for the time, but that also creates instances where I'm either left trying to clear an unfairly tight gap in a rush, or just waiting for eternity until they hit the right vertical pattern at the right time. The point is, when sliding off the edge of a platform, or just barely hitting the dangerous part of an enemy when it looked like you should have cleared it, or whatever else leads to your game over, it doesn't exactly feel great all the time, particularly because of the way the save system works. To save in DKC, you have to make it to a save tile on the world map. Each section of the world map is linear, and sometimes you have to go through several levels before you reach a save tile. The problem? Once you enter a new section of the world map, you can't leave that section until you reach a fast travel tile. Sometimes you have to do upwards of a third of the world map section without getting a game over before you're allowed to save your progress and or leave the section. And if you get a game over, you're sent back to the last save, not the beginning of the level, not the beginning of the world. Bosses are generally really bland as well. They're usually designed around a very basic pattern and nothing else. They also repeat later on in a marginally harder form. The bosses honestly just sort of feel out of place and rarely are designed around DKC's unique mechanics in any way. Sometimes, particularly due to the extremely simple animations of most of the bosses, I wonder if the reason the bosses are bland is actually because they didn't have the time or cartridge space or resources to give them more frames of animation with their fancy new tools. I can't confirm that, but it is really peculiar that so many bosses barely seem to animate at all. If they wanted them to be engagingly complex bosses, they'd need more frames of animation, hence why I come to that conclusion. Well, at least DKC is full of secrets, which sounds good for people like me. I mean, I highlighted how well each of the last 3 games hid secrets to amplify the exploration aspects of their worlds. DKC's secrets, though, a lot of them are pretty questionable in design. A lot of DKC's secrets are well hidden, but not hidden well. Many of them are just off-screen barrels and things you'll accidentally run into while making a mistake, rather than finding them through skill or observation. Meanwhile, a load more of them are hidden in the environment, where you usually have to use a nearby barrel or a high drop to break a wall or a section of the ground to reveal the secret. Sometimes this is denoted by things like a pile of leaves on the ground, which is great. Other times, you have no real way of knowing where the secrets even are, if there's one around you at all. Most secret walls look identical to normal walls. Often you get one barrel, meaning one chance, to find a secret. So if you don't throw the barrel at the correct wall, you have to die or restart the level to try again. It's nothing but a guessing game most of the time. A simple solution would have been to clearly denote more of the secret walls, since the barrels themselves are often already hidden, requiring luck or experimentation to find. Rather than force players to guess and fail repeatedly, why not make it a platforming challenge? Once you find the hidden barrel, you have to make your way to the clearly denoted breakable surface without the barrel getting destroyed. Also, it would be great if the barrels respawn so that you could just keep retrying until you get it. The challenge or the secret is the part that's engaging, not the fact that you have to use guesswork and luck and repetition to find it. While I'm sure there's more to them, I also didn't find much use in the animal buddies. I personally didn't come across them very often, and when I did, they were usually lost to me in under 10 seconds since they mostly just made me a bigger target. The swordfish was probably the one I got the most use out of, but otherwise, they more or less served as a damage boost like Yoshi in Mario World. This is all pretty frustrating already, but it's still fair enough that I wouldn't be generally too hard on a game for these issues. While these things can be improved, if the game's core mechanics are solid enough, I think a player could still be expected to work around these quirks. Not every game is going to be able to have uniform, perfectly square hitboxes that match their sprites, so unless they're absolutely awful, it's fine to expect a player to learn to deal with them. Same with the save system. It's brutal and inconsistent because of the placement of the save tiles, but it's not really unfair. The bosses are mostly a big lot of nothing, but plenty of bosses in platformers of the time were bland. Even Super Mario World and Sonic didn't do much with their bosses. Secrets are optional in DKC meanwhile, so I can only be so upset with those as well. Animal buddies? Who needs them? The point is, all of these things could be overlooked as minor annoyances if the game itself was really polished otherwise. However, one problem in DKC is so pervasive and inexcusable that it amplifies everything else immeasurably. It got to the point where now that I'm done with the game, I have no desire to ever play through it again, and am glad it's over with. That problem is the camera. The camera in this game is regularly so awful that I'm amazed it was ever considered acceptable, honestly. Mario's camera in Super Mario World does one of two things depending on the stage. It will either follow Mario vertically until he reaches the top of the level, at which point he'll go off screen if he continues to ascend. But if you pay attention, you'll notice that there are rarely any platforms and obstacles that force you to do complex challenges while regularly jumping out of view. So this doesn't really affect the player unless they force themselves to stay above the screen using the cape or something. The other thing the camera will do in Mario World is stick to a single vertical position, specifically in stages where the level is so tightly enclosed that there's nothing above or below Mario to explore in the first place. This happens most often in auto-scrollers, but also happens underground at times. The camera also likes to keep Mario slightly left of center when moving right, and slightly right of center when moving left, so you can have a bit more room to see where you're going. Sonic games, by contrast, nearly always keep Sonic dead center, with CD as an exception. This is primarily because you spend a lot more time going in both directions in Sonic, rather than just from left to right, so it was smarter to keep Sonic centered at all times than to have the camera lurching back and forth with every directional change. Instead, it ebbs and flows with the momentum of the stage. However, under specific circumstances, Sonic can actually start outrunning the camera, though this only happens in places where you're completely safe from harm. It's a set piece, not a glitch or an oversight, so it doesn't damage the gameplay. The point is, how you build your camera in a platformer is extraordinarily important and can be really nuanced work a lot of the time. You can't just use a one-size-fits-all camera. The camera in a platformer is as important as tires are to a race car. If you don't have the right setup, you're gonna have a hell of a time getting to the finish line. I don't want to sound like I'm abusing a much-loved game from the childhood of a ton of my viewers, but DKC's camera regularly felt like a joke. Now, before you get angry, I did try DKC 2 and 3 right afterward to see if this problem persisted, and it doesn't seem like that's the case. I didn't play past the first world in either game, but due to the much greater emphasis on vertical level design and general level complexity, it seems like Rare understood their issues and improved. But in the first game, I can't honestly believe the game shipped and was praised so much with a camera in this condition. That's a big claim, so let me illustrate. Here are just a few examples of how bad the camera can be at times. Keep in mind really quickly that my capture card doesn't like the SNES Classic for some reason, so I lost some of my most damning footage to corruption that looks like this at its mildest. That's also why I had to work around certain parts of each of the previous games, in case you were one of the people that noticed that some areas of those games were mysteriously missing from my edits. Anyway, here's the footage from my notes that was still somewhat salvageable. The most basic problem we can explore is the obvious one I set up when talking about Mario World's camera. The amount of times the levels force you to do complex or dangerous platforming where your characters are forced off screen with every jump. There are so many sections in so many levels where you're just stuck too close to the upper limits of the camera, praying that you're going to land each jump where you're blindly aiming it. The game also occasionally hides enemies right at the top of the screen when you're at the bottom, usually birds that throw things at you. They and their projectiles generally do a good job of blending in a bit too well. The snow world is actually a great example of a lot of the stuff that's wrong. For example, some enemies, like these blue alligators, come from off-screen too quickly to react to, unless you know they're coming or you're going as slow as humanly possible. It's made even worse in this world specifically thanks to the slippery ground, the blizzards in some of the sections that obscure your vision, and the fact that this game adores bottomless pits in general, regardless of which world you're in. A short while later in this level, I had to bounce on a blue alligator to dispatch of him, which means I can't see the short chompy one below when I land, so I take a hit before I can react. Meanwhile, notice that I can't adequately see the bee at the bottom of this first rope quickly enough, so it's needlessly difficult to time a jump that allows me to avoid the bee at the top of the second rope. This stuff is technically possible, sure, but only with lots of memorization and trial and error. These are cheap traps, and they're all caused by the camera not meshing at all with the obstacles and enemy placement. Here's another example from a later level. Want more examples? Let's keep going then. Why am I more or less always at the top of the screen while ascending underwater, as seen here? Wouldn't it make much more sense to shift me toward the bottom so that I can see where I'm going? As a small side note, in the very next level, why does my torchbird buddy light directly forward instead of from above? Because of this, every time I make a minor adjustment to my position, his light flicks needlessly back and forth, which is just another little thing that can lead to deaths in the moment for little real, meaningful reason. I don't really feel that it's my fault that I take a hit while doing minor platforming adjustments and therefore can't see where I'm going. Like, let me ask, what was I supposed to do about the screen not scrolling further up here? You know, other than just memorize what's coming up? These types of issues are almost ever present, and they're only exacerbated by the really precise challenges of the other sections, like these barrel gauntlets that lead to instant death with one mistake, forcing you to repeat levels and sections ad nauseum. I'm not really fond of long gauntlets of instant death in the first place, but putting them in the middle of platforming with terrible camera issues just needlessly risks game overs. By the way, in case you didn't notice, the color of the tip of a lot of barrels is the same color as the blizzard in the snow levels, making the timing yet harder for little reason. Not to mention, some barrels work differently despite looking the same. Why do some with white tips rotate back and forth, while some don't? It's easy for the player to expect one thing, get another, and die because of it. Simply making the barrels with different properties look slightly different would have solved the issue. They were already doing that anyway. Obstacles of other types often have different timings too, with no indication that this is the case, like these oil barrels. Heck, they even change the way the minecart levels play without telling you. Why? Here's the thing. I understand why people really like this game, and are under the impression that it's challenging but fair. Plenty of other critics have said this very thing, in fact. Generally, the people who greatly enjoy and/or defend DKC have played it since they were younger. I'm not arguing that nostalgia has clouded their vision. Instead, I'm arguing that they learned the unfair design and have understood for decades how to work around it, similar to how I did the same thing with Sonic 2's beginner traps and occasionally cheap enemy placement. Play a game enough, and nostalgia or not, you start to become numb to its issues. It can be really hard work to notice these problems when you're so used to avoiding them. I think a lot of people remember how this game feels, its shortcomings, and how to avoid specific unfair obstacles. I myself, when recapturing cleaner footage of the levels that went corrupt, had a significantly easier time with the levels I redid. Some of them I even cleared without dying, where I died 20 plus times on my first go-round. But it wasn't just because I'd gotten better at the game, it was also largely, and I'd argue primarily, because I knew about the cheap tricks already. I knew when the game was gonna troll me. I don't think DKC is an outright awful game, but I can't really call it good by any means. I don't even think it's okay or mediocre really. The game works when you know it, but it has terrible flaws if you don't. However, if it's any consolation, as I said, I played the first world of DKC 2 and 3 to compare, and you know what? So far, they really are genuinely massive improvements. Because they have more emphasis on vertical platforming, the camera and level design seem to have much more work put into them to compensate. They're much more well designed and fair. These games also look better, have far more fair and interesting enemy designs, and overall came across as much more consistent. Sure, that could totally change as the games go on. By contrast to the rest of the game, DKC 1's first world was pretty good too, but even then I was seeing smaller versions of the larger problems that cropped up later, which didn't seem present in DKC 2 or 3. And so ends the month of Super Nintendo Classics. Overall, I'm happy with how things turned out. While I definitely don't plan on ever going back to DKC 1 if I can avoid it, I'm surprised I found the other games in this month of so good today. I figured they'd have shown their age a lot more than they did, so I'd call this a win. Anyway, what did you guys think? Do you like DKC? I'm sure you do. What makes it so enjoyable to you? Have you noticed the issues I explored here already? Do you think the sequels are an improvement? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. If DKC fans don't kill me first.